Welcome everyone to Diabetes Canada's 2019 Type 1 webinar series. My name is Grace Leader and I will be your host today. We are delighted that you are able to join us today for the webinar entitled How to Stay Safe While Driving with Type 1 Diabetes. I would like to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Anne Kenshole, and thank her for joining us today. Dr. Anne Kenshole trained in the United Kingdom and initially planned to come to Canada for just 3 weeks, and yet 50 years later, she's still here. Dr. Kenshole has a special interest in type 1 diabetes and continues to be impressed by the way people live with it so well. So without further ado, I present to you Dr. Anne Kenshole.
Good day. It's a pleasure to be here. This slide shows approximately 300 gravestones. That represents about the number of people who die in road accidents in Canada each month. Now, 10% of people in Canada have diabetes. What do we know? Are people with diabetes as safe as other drivers? Conceivably safer. Sorry, I can't go forward. Okay, now. The answer is yes. At least 95% of people with diabetes are just as good on the roads as anybody else. However, a small percentage, perhaps around about 5%, specifically of people with type 1, are at identifiable risk of having accidents and episodes on the road. And there is a common cause for this. When somebody has frequent blood sugars below 4, which is the usually taken definition of hypoglycemia, if they go low often, they no longer are able to feel the typical symptoms of hypoglycemia. Another way of putting that is asymptomatic hypoglycemia. It's also called neuroglycopenia, which means the brain is affected by inadequate glucose at that time. And people who experience this may have lots of sugars in the 3s and in the 2s. Even in a case I'm familiar with, a patient had a blood sugar of 1.9 millimoles when he was in a lab, and the ambulance was not called. He appeared to be acting, speaking, and so on normally. I do not know if he drove away from the lab. But people's thermostat, if you like, for perceiving hypoglycemia can be set progressively lower and lower if they have frequent hypoglycemia. Now, why is this? The normal response to hypoglycemia is the first responder, of course, is adrenaline. Everybody with type 1 knows what adrenaline feels like. One feels sweaty, one's pulse goes up, you can feel shaky. Some people feel hungry, some people don't. And this is, the body is very finely attuned to sensing and reacting to hypoglycemia. Why? Because the body perceives hypoglycemia as dangerous. Very particularly, the brain has to have adequate sugar to function. Other organs in the body can turn to fats. For example, the brain can't. So a constant availability of sugar is vital for brain function. But with repeated hypoglycemia, the body sort of assumes that this must be the new norm, that having blood sugars in the 3s or even the 2s is okay, so it no longer responds by pouring out the adrenaline or indeed the whole cascade of other hormones which are secreted when somebody does have hypoglycemia. So why can this happen? Why can the thermostat, as I call it, be reset? Well, that's the cause, I beg your pardon. Sorry, moving on to the next slide. I just want to take you very quickly through 3 Ontario tragedies which have resulted in 5 deaths, 2 honeymoon couple as they left the church, and one teen has been permanently disabled. And I think it's very important to categorize the drivers because they were, upstanding citizens. 3 middle-aged professional men, responsible car drivers, excellent driving records, meticulous in their self-management of their long-standing type 1, 20, 30 years and more of type 1. 2 of the patients were on pumps and using CGM. I don't have details of the third case. What is important in the 2 cases I'm familiar with, both of the drivers were noticed to be either exhibiting odd behavior, speaking unusually fast or not making particularly good sense in one case, or noted to be driving erratically within a few minutes before the fatal crash. So what is the science behind neuroglycopenia? And there's a lot now in the medical literature, the diabetes literature, about what happens when sugar levels are too low. And I'm going to quote one study, which is really a seminal study in my view. This was done down in Virginia a few years ago. 37 people with type 1 diabetes were agreed to take part in this study. And they were in a lab. Their blood sugar was kept within the 6 to 7 range steadily for an hour or 2 to establish equilibrium. This was done by having IVs running with glucose in and another IV with tiny bits of insulin in. So literally the blood sugar could be kept within a steady range. And then, having done that, the blood sugar was lowered from 4 to 3.4 and kept steadily again at 3.4. And at that time, each of the drivers was asked, how do you feel? Do you think you're hypoglycemic? Are you safe to drive? Here you are, there's juice if you want it. And though some patients, some drivers felt that they were hypoglycemic at 3.4, none of them wanted juice. Already, their brains were not functioning absolutely normally. Their judgment was off. They continued the experiment. They brought the sugar down from 3.4 to 2.8. Let it equilibrate. Again, the same questions. Actually, the clients that are diabetic patients were asked the same questions every 5 minutes through this study. Again, how do you feel? Do you think you're hypoglycemic? Do you think you're safe to drive? Do you want juice? Now, all of the 37 patients felt that they were low at 2.8, but still, some of them, those with really neuroglycopenia, they knew it was slightly off, but their judgment was really impaired. And quite a few of them, again, refused to take juice, though they knew they were low. And while this experiment was going on, the drivers were in a driving simulator. Here's an example of one. And I don't know if you've ever been in one, but it's remarkably lifelike. You see traffic coming towards you. There are people on the sidewalk. A dog runs out into the road at some stage. There are traffic lights. You're required to do left turns, right turns, whatever. It's just like driving. And at the same time, they were wearing a headdress like this. This is a portable EEG, a brainwave test. So their brainwaves could be recorded throughout this progression of hypoglycemia. And what were the outcomes? Well, I touched on them before. Some felt low at 3.4, but felt safe and refused juice. However, their driving performance was already deteriorating. They were braking or accelerating not very smoothly. When a dog ran into the road, they took quite a longer time than usual to jump on the brake. In fact, in other words, their reflexes were slowed. And by the time they were down to 2.8, many still feeling, I'm fine, I'm a good driver, refusing juice, they were all over the road, weaving over the central line, making left turns when they were told by a voice command to take a right turn, and so on. I mean, just the people you don't want to have on the 401 or anywhere under those circumstances. And here are the brain waves on the left, which are showing a fairly normal pattern from one individual, well, a normal pattern at the beginning. And you can see the second half of the tracing, it's just, again, chaotic. There's massive alteration in the brain waves throughout the entire head, but particularly focused in a couple of areas, those responsible for judgment. So it's important because here is a biological underpinning of what happens when people go low and aren't able to recognize it appropriately. And what is very important, after the blood sugars were back to normal, it took 45 minutes on average for the brain waves to return to normal. And that's where in the Canadian Diabetes Canada guidelines, it says, treat yourself and wait 45 minutes before you turn the key in the ignition. It says that in the American guidelines. It says it in the UK guidelines. It's universal because this information came from scientific studies that the brain does not naturally normalize for its function for 45 minutes after a significant low. There we are. So, very importantly, can neuroglycopenia be reversed? And the answer is in most people, and I emphasize most people, by total avoidance of hypoglycemia for anywhere from 1 to 6 months. The average length of time is about 3 months. And yes, it means that the individual's A1C will rise, usually 1% or slightly less, but if that's the price you have to pay, at least temporarily, to be able to drive safely for your own sake, for the sake of your family, and for the sake of other road users, it's worth the candle. So that is the most important thing to do. And because the body is now no longer being hammered by hypoglycemia, it allows the normal hormonal response to start to improve, so that if everything goes well, one should be able to perceive hypoglycemia in the way one did when one first got type 1 diabetes. The other important message I would suggest I want to offer is consider, if anybody does experience this, are you over-insulinized? And that is where a little bit of biology comes in. The normal pancreas, the normal beta cells in a lean adult, i.e. not overweight, secretes 30 to 35 units of insulin a day. That's all. So if somebody's taking 45, 50, 55 units and they are not obese, because we know that overweight and certainly obesity results in an element of insulin resistance, including in people with type 1. But the normal weight individual, if they're taking more insulin than seems physiologically appropriate, what is that insulin doing? Well, it may well be, if you like, stacking up in the bloodstream, and one of the significant causes of, quotes, brittle diabetes and people having lows for reasons they can't understand. And I expect people listening and watching many of you are truly very insulin sensitive. So a difference of 2 or 3 units in a 24-hour period can make a huge difference. And recall too, because again, I expect many people are on pumps, I hope they are, and when you started on a pump, your total daily dose was automatically cut down because so many people are actually over-insulinized. And labile control, as I say, is often due to over-insulinization. And then a quick word about the A1C. The literature suggests that most events on the road, including in people with diabetes, well, specifically people in diabetes, does not correlate well with their A1C. Most events are kind of one-off. A meal is delayed, or somebody was extra busy and therefore sugars were running lower than usual, and so on. In hindsight, and these are the things we try and analyze at the Department of Transport when people who've had an event, when they fill in the diabetes questionnaire, we try to determine, was this likely to be a one-off, or is this a situation where this driver is really at risk of having further adverse things happen on the road. Anyhow, there's only one study so far looking very specifically at the A1Cs and diabetic drivers. And this was in Ontario, using Ontario data between 2003 and 2005. And that actually did show a correlation. Here you can see people who had an A1C equal to or less than 6.9 had a 3-fold likelihood of having a crash, a road event, compared with somebody with an A1C of 8 to 8.9. Now, I'm not suggesting that one should be aiming for an A1C in the 8s, not at all, but the risk was 3-fold higher and twice as high if the A1C was 7 through 7.9. So this, to the best of my knowledge, is the only scientific data on this subject. So I'm going to leave it there and turn it back to our moderator.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kenshole. That was really informative, really interesting, and really good information for our participants. So now I'd like to welcome our second speaker, Sergeant Murray Campbell, and thank him for joining us today. And before turning it over to Murray, I'd like to give you a brief introduction. So Sergeant Murray Campbell is the Supervisor of Traffic Services for the Toronto Police. He manages a platoon of traffic investigators, accident reconstructionists, drug recognition experts, and breathalyzer technicians who check people for impaired driving. Sergeant Campbell is the lead investigator on all serious life-threatening collisions involving death. Sergeant Campbell has been living with type 1 diabetes for 32 years. He was on a regimen of multiple daily injections for 20 years, and for the last 10 years has been on an insulin pump. So without further ado, I present to you Sergeant Murray Campbell.
Thank you very much, Grace. And hello, everybody. I want to introduce myself, first of all, not as Sergeant Murray Campbell, but as Murray Campbell. I've been diabetic for over 32 years and driving for almost 30 of those years. Initially starting out as a type 1 diabetic, I probably was into what Dr. Kenshole has described as neuroglycopenia. I was of loose control starting out as a type 1 and driving at the same time, and suffered multiple events where I would be driving and suffering from low blood sugar. Since then, from going on to pump and subsequent to that to the CGM, my control has become greatly increased. When you get a little bit older and you realize the consequences of your actions, you start to take a little more notice of the world around you and your effect that you have on them. Additionally to being a type 1 diabetic, I am a sergeant with Toronto Police Traffic Services. I have a platoon, like was said earlier, of traffic investigators. We go out to all the collisions across the city of Toronto, and to the more serious ones that involve life-threatening injuries or death, I come out and I am the supervisor in charge of the scene of those investigations. Part of what we use to conduct those investigations, like I said earlier, was technical collision reconstructionists, technical collision photographers to gather evidence of what happened, drug recognition experts, and by experts I mean that these people have been qualified in the court as an expert to give opinion evidence for people that are impaired by drugs, both legal and not legal drugs, and were caught operating a motor vehicle. An awful lot of our calls that we get are for impaired drivers. Now, an impaired driver, by definition in the code, which I will go over a little bit later, is somebody who's consumed drugs or alcohol to the extent that it affects their ability to operate a motor vehicle. A lot of these calls that we get are from people on the roads that are calling in suspected impaired drivers. On some instances, it is found out later on that they're in fact not impaired drivers, not impaired by drugs or alcohol, and I mean by an illegal drug, but they are in fact hypoglycemic drivers. These drivers are exhibiting the same symptoms or show exactly the same effects as an impaired driver. They become combative, argumentative. They are slurred speech, glossy-eyed, and people believe them to be impaired, and that's why we get the call out for them. These people are not only impaired drivers, but the hypoglycemic drivers are involved in collisions, some of them serious, some of them fatal. And I'm going to talk about one fatal collision that happened. This is not a collision that I was involved in. This is not a collision that I investigated in any way, but it is a collision that happened in Ontario that changed the way that we deal with people who are licensed drivers and are diabetics, both type 1 and type 2. I have been involved in investigating a few of those type of crashes, and I specifically do not want to talk about those ones because some of them are still going on in the courts today. So impaired drivers. Well, should diabetics be allowed to drive? Should we be allowed to drive in Ontario? Because we know that we pose an increased risk to everybody that's out there. Our potential for crashing and being involved in collisions is much, much higher than everybody else. So the answer to that is yes, we should be allowed to drive. We are human beings with a disease and maybe a disability, but we need to be able to drive with certain conditions. And those conditions are put on there for the greater good of everybody. Okay? Like I said before, diabetes is a disease, and it's been classified as a disability within Canada. We have certain rights in Canada that are guaranteed under the Charter of Human Rights, the Canadian Human Rights Act, and specifically in Ontario, which also governs our driver's licenses, it is the Human Rights Code. So it's, in summary, it states that all people should be free from discrimination due to their disability. When you think about that, if we are considered to have a disability, why are we governed differently than the rest of the people that are on the roads? Well, we must understand that driving is a privilege and not a right. All right? We, all across North America, type 1 diabetics are allowed to drive with certain conditions. And those certain conditions are placed upon us because of a greater good, a need for a greater good for the greater population. All right? The risk that we face is both hypoglycemia, like was described earlier, but also hyperglycemia that also affects things like your eyesight and your nerve endings and things like that, which has a change in your body's ability to able to operate a motor vehicle correctly. All right? The Charter of Rights has survived many challenges by people saying that it's unjust and unfair that diabetics or other people with other disabilities be treated differently. And it has been found by the court that this is a reasonable change for diabetics to be treated differently for this greater good. All right? So what is impaired driving? So are hypoglycemic drivers impaired drivers? So if we read the definition coming out of the criminal code, is impaired driving means operating or having care and control of a conveyance where your ability to do so has been impaired by in any degree by consuming drugs, alcohol, or a combination of the two. Now, can insulin be that drug? Can insulin be the cause of your impairment? Well, yes, it can cause you to be impaired and be an impaired driver. But I want to put forth the caveat before I continue on there is that being type 1 diabetic for 32 years, not once have I ever wanted to have a low blood sugar. Not once have I ever wanted to get into a car and drive with a low blood sugar. I don't enjoy being hypoglycemic. And as you can well imagine that everyone else in type 1, when they're treating a low blood sugar, they overcompensate for it because they do not want to be continuing in that state. Where all of the impaired drivers that I have pulled over and charged, and I've charged many of them, every one of them has made a decision at some point to drink alcohol, consume a drug, and made the conscious decision to put their keys in their hand, get into their car, and operate that car. So going forward, are impaired drivers the same as insulin impaired drivers? Well, everyone that I've pulled over shows signs of glossy eyes, swaying, falling down, reduced cognitive ability. Their decision-making ability is impaired. They're sweating. They have slurred speech. They're anxious. They want to fight. All the same traits that are displayed when even myself has a hypoglycemic attack. All right? So can impaired drivers be classified the same as a drug-impaired driver that is using insulin? Well, the change there is the intent. There are two parts to prove a charge within the courts in Canada, and one is the actus reus, which is the action of doing something that is wrong, and the mens rea, having the mental ability to commit the crime, where most type 1 diabetics that I'm aware of in hypoglycemia don't ever have that mental ability that they want to get in the car and drive. So how does that affect us? Well, there are some consequences of driving while our blood sugar is lower. All right, there are over 7,300 insulin-dependent diabetics reported in Ontario, and that's stats from a few years ago. So what risks do they have when they're driving a car? All right. I want to look into one case in specific, and that case has caused an awful lot of changes in the way that insulin-dependent diabetics and also type 2 diabetics are reported and managed within the province of Ontario. This is a case that shows how the bureaucratic nightmare of our government broke down and allowed something to happen and to continue to happen even after the event. So the case that I'm going to talk about caused an inquiry to be launched in 2014 by the Ombudsman for Ontario, Andre Martin, and he produced a study called Better Safe Than Sorry. This is Andre Martin here, and this is him presenting this case, Better Safe Than Sorry. So this case involved in 2009, a Hamilton High School teacher named Alan Mackey. He was tried and convicted of 3 counts of dangerous driving causing death because of an event that occurred. He was charged also with 3 counts of criminal negligence causing death, but was not convicted of that. And the reason, I have an opinion on the reason he was not convicted of the criminal negligence, but I'm going to show you that both these 2 charges kind of fit into what happened on the day. So a bit of the background that happened in 2009. 3 people were killed that day. An 81-year-old cyclist named Tang Zidong, a 27-year-old newlywed was Hannah Gordon Roche a 29-year-old newlywed, her husband, Jeffrey Roche. All right? It all started on the last day of school for high school teacher Alan Mackey, who was a 40-year-old type 1 diabetic, and he was treating his diabetes with multiple daily injections of insulin. He was cleaning up his classroom for his last day. He was very excited to leave, had an awful lot on his mind. He wanted to get started in the summer vacation, and tested before he left the school and found that he was low. It didn't say that he was overly low, but low enough that he had a snack to treat his low blood sugar, which he had done many times. He unfortunately didn't wait and retest, like Dr. Kenshole had described as a must that we do, but instead he packed up his car and headed out. He made his way towards the bank, and Hamilton police at that time had received phone calls about a suspected impaired driver that was driving erratically on the roads. And that driver was Alan Mackey at the time. So after doing his banking and talking with some of the bank tellers at the bank, it was noted he was acting weird. He was not himself. He was a little bit lethargic. His answers to questions were not what would be normally expected of him. But he continued on, not knowing that his blood sugar was low. At some point through his driving, he came across a cyclist that was cycling down the road, and that was 81-year-old Tong Ridong. He actually struck Mr. Ridong and killed him instantly at the side of the road there. Mr. Mackey did not stop his car, but continued on driving from there, and became involved in a second collision where he ran into the back of a very small car that contained both Mr. and Mrs. Roche. That collision caused their car to spin out and come in contact with a fast-moving oncoming pickup truck. As a result, both the occupants of the car were killed. At that point, because his car was no longer able to be operated, Mr. Mackey stopped driving. As you can imagine, the scene must have been quite chaotic. Two separate scenes with 3 dead people, an injured person in the pickup truck as well, and possibly an injured Mr. Mackey. At the arrival of ambulance and fire and police, obviously the most serious injured were treated first, and Mr. Mackey was subsequently treated a short time later. Ambulance services at that point found that his blood sugar was extremely low at that time and treated him for his low blood sugar. When his blood sugar came up again, and through questions to the Hamilton police, Mr. Mackey had no idea what he had done. He was not aware of the collision. He could see the carnage around him, but had no idea that he was involved in it other than he was slightly injured from the collision and his car was. So I asked you, whose fault was it? Was it Mr. Mackey's, who did not make the decision to have diabetes, be susceptible to hypoglycemia? Was it the other people that were on the roadway? No, I think we can pretty much all come to the consensus that Mr. Mackey was the person who caused all these collisions. Now remember, Mr. Mackey did not make the decision to drive when his blood sugar was low. He was not aware that he was doing it. What Mr. Mackey did was not spend the time after he realized he was low to wait the time to see if his blood sugar had come up. So Mr. Mackey was charged with 6 counts of criminal code offenses. The first one was being dangerous operation of a motor vehicle. So it has been slightly changed from what was in the criminal code last year. And it includes not just a motor vehicle, but it also includes a conveyance, which can be anything used to move people safely, including things like a canoe. So if you read the section for dangerous operation of the criminal code, it's everybody who commits an offense who operates a conveyance in a manner that, having regard to all the circumstances, is dangerous to the public. Well, Mr. Mackey did operate his motor vehicle. It was dangerous to the public. Given the entire set of circumstances, Mr. Mackey had an obligation to check his blood sugar before he started driving in the manner that he did. There are 2 subsections that are listed up there under the criminal code for the outcome of any crashes that occur because of the dangerous operation, including causing death that he was charged with. Additionally to the charge of dangerous operation, Mr. Mackey was charged with criminal negligence causing death ×3. Now, criminal negligence under Section 219 of the Criminal Code states that everybody is criminally negligent who, in doing anything or by omitting to do anything that is their duty to do, shows a wanton and reckless disregard for the lives or safety of other persons. Now, Mr. Mackey at that time did show, in my opinion, a wanton and reckless disregard for the safety of others because he knew that he should have been checking his blood sugar before he operated the motor vehicle. He knew that his blood sugar was low, and he waited. He did not wait before he started operating his motor vehicle at the time. Now, of note there, if you read Section 220 of the Criminal Code, the consequence of getting convicted of criminal negligence causing death can be up to life imprisonment, which is quite serious. So both of these sections fit the circumstances that Mr. Mackey was involved in, but the court only convicted him of the dangerous driving, and I believe that's probably because of the lower penalty that's involved with the dangerous driving causing death as opposed to the criminal negligence causing death. So the reason the Andre Martin conducted an inquiry in this because not only was it tragic that the deaths occurred, but at that time the Ministry of Transportation had not removed Mr. Mackey's driver's license even after this event occurred. He continued to drive for another 18 months after this event, going through the criminal process, driving to the courthouse every day by himself, which absolutely upset the general public to see that he continued to drive even after having killed 3 people. Now, we've had reporting of medical conditions in Ontario, either self-reporting or reporting by physicians, since 1968. But for some reason, this one got caught up in the bureaucratic red tape, and Mr. Mackey's driver's license remained in effect throughout this period of time. This is what caused the inquiry to happen, and as a result, 18 recommendations were made for changes into the way that the Ministry of Transportation issues or suspends driver's licenses of people with type 1 diabetes. So this is a fact sheet that is put out by the Ministry of Transportation that shows exactly the increased scrutiny that type 1 diabetics face. Both type 1 and type 2 diabetics face an increased risk, but type 1 diabetics, especially the ones using insulin, are now required to self-report and are required to have an assessment done by a physician or a nurse practitioner and submit that to the Ministry of Transportation. The Ministry of Transportation will conduct background checks of driving history and collision history to determine if this person is a suitable candidate to be allowed to drive in Ontario. As you can see here on this slide, commercial drivers, people driving buses and big rigs that have a greater risk of harm to the public, face a higher scrutiny. The more stringent medical examinations happens more often, and the reporting of it needs to continue at a higher rate than the regular Class 2 driver's licenses. It also makes it mandatory for everybody when renewing their driver's license to make the declaration that they are insulin dependent and diabetic. If you guys have seen recently on your driver's license, that is a requirement. When I was first licensed, no one ever knew I was a diabetic up until probably about 2014 when this requirement came into effect. The ministry had no idea that I was a type 1 diabetic, taking insulin And because of better control that I was having, my doctor had no reason to report that to the ministry. So I'm going to ask you, whose obligation is it to drive safe? Well, obviously it's ours, but it goes beyond that as well, right? The Ministry of Transportation has an obligation to keep the general public safe. They need to prohibit the high-risk drivers from driving on the road. They do that already for people suffering from epilepsy or people that have eyesight problems that cannot meet a certain level. They prohibit them from driving. Because of this inquiry, it became more evident of the need to do that for drivers suffering from very bad control or loose control of the type 1 diabetes. Secondly, it's physicians' responsibility. They are the ones that need to identify those people that are at higher risk when driving on the roads. They had been doing this since 1968, but the obligation became theirs, where they could be charged for failing to report this to the ministry. All right? Some of the things that they're required to report are type 1, type 2 diabetics, people with a loss of vision, people that have a substance dependency, both drugs and alcohol. They are required to report to the Ministry of Transportation. People, like I said before, with epilepsy, once again, they are required by law to report to the ministry so an assessment can be done. But most importantly, whose obligation is it? It's yours. It really is yours. It's yours. You need to make that decision every day. You need to, when you get into the car, I make it a habit that I check my blood sugar before I drive every single time. All right? The way to do that is through a finger prick and check on your blood sugar meter, or by using a CGM. I'll be able to tell you whether you're trending up, trending down. You need to know this information before you drive. It is recommended that you check your blood sugar every 4 hours. I, on the other hand, being a person who can operate a motor vehicle from 10 hours a day at my work, I also spend some time commuting back and forth to work. So my day of driving has the potential to be over 12 hours long. And because of that, I've made the decision that at the minimum, I'm checking my blood sugar at least every 2 hours. Not only to keep me safe while I'm operating as a police officer, but to keep me safe while I'm driving. We need to obviously report our hypoglycemic unawareness to our doctors. Like Dr. Kenshole had explained, this is not a permanent effect, and that neuroglycopenia can be reversed, and with your doctor's help, it can come back to normal so that we are better suited and better, safer drivers. One of the biggest things you can do, keep a fast-acting carb in your car. I keep a bottle of Dex tablets in my car. I usually have one in my pocket. I usually have one in my bag that I carry back and forth to work, but keep it there just in case you need it. The worst time to find out you don't have anything with you to treat it is when you're in your car and confused and away from home. This is a slide that I took from my diabetes education center, the Charles Bass Diabetes Center in Whitby. This is put up on the door as I entered into the diabetes center for everyone to see. And it is a great use of a graphic to show drivers what they should do when they're facing hypoglycemia. This slide was derived from the information that was provided by the Diabetes Canada 2018 Clinical Practice Guidelines, which I was honored to actually have a part in. I was on a panel giving recommendations of what should have been given to diabetics through the physicians. As you can see, the 5 and drive, you're green and good to go. So check your blood sugar and make sure it's above 5, but also make sure which way you're trending. If you're trending up and trending down, you may need to make actions before you're driving. If your blood sugar is between 4 to 5, it is recommended that you have at least 15 grams of carb before you're driving, but to wait to make sure that that 15 grams of carb is going to affect you in a positive way. If Mr. Mackey had done that, he wouldn't be in the situation that he found himself in, where 3 other people had died. It shows here to stop. The red slide there, not to drive when your blood sugar is below 4. And my suggestion to you is take the keys out. We all know that we make bad decision making. We have a bad decision making ability when our blood sugar is low, and our cognitive ability to make good decisions is impaired. So take the keys out. Don't even think about putting them in. Take the 15 grams of carbs and wait at least 15 minutes to test. If it has not corrected itself, repeat it until you come above 5. As Dr. Kenshole had described before, the biggest thing is to wait afterwards. My personal opinion is after I'm having the 15 grams of carb, my blood sugar has come up, I have an additional carb, including a protein, a long-acting protein, and I wait at least 40 minutes before I start driving. That is the end of my presentation. I'm sure it's caused some thought in people's minds when they're driving. There are consequences to our actions, and we are the owners of our actions, and we have to make the best decisions possible before we put ourselves or others at risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Campbell. That was really informative, really helpful, and lots of great information in there. So we'll move on to, we do have a little bit of time for questions. So just note that for any questions that we're unable to answer today, please send us an email at webinars@diabetes.ca, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. So the first question I have, and it's related, that we have, is I think, Sergeant Campbell, if you can answer. So you talked in the example about someone testing their blood sugar before they drive and their blood sugar being low and then getting an accident. Is someone just as legally responsible if they check their blood sugar and they are above 5 and then say have no symptoms and get into an accident because their blood sugar was low, but they tested above 5 before they started driving?
So in today's society, we are all liable for everything and all the actions that we take. In the example that I gave with Mr. Mackey, it was nobody else's fault other than his that he operated a motor vehicle and killed 3 people. You will be held responsible for that, both civilly and criminally. The best way to do it is to prevent it. I try to have the best control that I can have now when I'm operating it. That doesn't mean I don't have blood sugars, but it's what actions do I take to ensure that it doesn't happen. The best way to do that is, quite frankly, by wearing a CGM and being aware of what is going on with your body. You know your body the best out of anybody, and you have to ensure that your blood sugar remains in a safe level while you're operating the car. If you can't do that, my best suggestion to you would be do not operate it until you can make it safe.
Thank you. Maybe Dr. Kenshole, we had a question about are there things that would impair your driving from high blood sugar? Would your judgment be impaired from high blood sugar?
Well, it's a good and somewhat controversial question. There was a very small study done in the early 90s, which wouldn't meet current day's scientific rigor, which showed not using a simulator, I think it was mental arithmetic, that people were slowed up a bit if they had an A1C of 12 and were running, which means you're running blood sugars up in the high teens and 20s the whole time. So not your ideally managed patient. And this study, they came to the conclusion that sustained high blood sugars are not good for the brain, which may be quite true, but whether one could link an occasional high, which we know can happen, for whatever reason people can bounce up into the teens and 20s, whether that actually affects driving performance at that time, it's unlikely. It's never been tested scientifically.
Thank you. Sergeant Campbell, could you maybe, what are some advice you have? Obviously, if you're having a low blood sugar, your judgment is impaired. So what are some things that you yourself might do in order to make sure that you're able to make the right decision, or what can someone who's maybe supporting someone living with diabetes do to help them when they might be having a low blood sugar, when their judgment might be impaired?
Well, my recommendation is to make it a habit that you check your blood sugar before you get into the car. I keep a tester in my glove compartment, and I use it every time before I get into the car and start driving. That is a habit that is done routinely by me. So if my blood sugar was to be a little bit lower, it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for me to pull my meter out and check myself. If I'm unaware that I'm going low, that may be my only ability to know that my blood sugar is going low. Like I said, keeping carbohydrates in your car ready, accessible, and pulling over right away, stopping your driving, and treating yourself or having others treat you may be your option. The alternative to that could be dire consequences. When you're driving for long periods of time, like sometimes I do, make it a habit. Set a reminder on your watch, set a reminder on your phone, if you have to stop, to know at maybe the top of the hour, every hour, that you're going to check your blood sugar and make sure that you're still in the right frame of mind and the right physical ability to operate your motor vehicle safely. Anything else that you can do to keep yourself safe while on the roadway is totally up to you. Better blood sugar control, better hypoglycemic awareness will always make you a better, safer driver.
That's great. Thank you. So I think we just have time for one last question. And this question, it's about CGM, so I'm a continuous glucose monitor. So I just want to preface by saying that I know in the presentation we talked about that CGMs are a really great tool. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of healthcare coverage, like public coverage for the CGM, and Diabetes Canada is advocating for those the CGM to be covered more availably in each province. But the question related to a CGM is, because the CGMs often use a smartphone as a transmitter, are there any issues related to distracted driving and using a CGM, Sergeant Campbell?
So distracted driving is anybody using or holding a handheld communication device. There's a lot of states in Ontario. There are some exceptions to it. You see Uber drivers driving around with a phone physically mounted to their car with a display screen continuously on. They're not allowed to actually use their phone while operating a vehicle on a roadway, but the display screen can be available to them to see if you're using that as your way to see which way your blood sugar is going. That may be an option to you. Other than that, if you are operating a motor vehicle and you are using a CGM that's communicating with your smartphone or your pump for that matter, best rule of thumb to avoid distracted driving would be to pull over to the side of the road, put your vehicle in park, and use your phone at that point. That is one of the exceptions in Ontario, that you are allowed to use your handheld communication device while operating a car. It has to be off the roadway, and it has to be in park or not set to be able to be put into motion. It is one of the options that I'm considering doing coming up, is even having one of those mounted in my police car, so that I may be able to use my cell phone to keep an eye on my blood sugars, not only through my pump, but through my phone as well.
Thank you. That's great. So that concludes our webinar for today, and I'd like to sincerely thank Dr. Kenshole and Sergeant Campbell for speaking on behalf of Diabetes Canada. It's been a wonderful learning experience.